Good morning, everyone. Namaskar. We welcome you all to the Leap First of the knowledge series on law, intellect, and property, organized by Symbiosis Law School, Noida, in association with Anand and Anand, one of the most premier law firms of India. Today's session is titled as Understanding the Basics of Patent Litigation. We are fortunate to have the best of the minds who work in this field. So today's session would be moderated by Ms. Riddhi Bajaj, and the panelists include Mr. Shravan Chopra, partner, Mr. Dhruv Anand, partner, Anand and Anand, and Mr. Vibhav Mithal, managing associate, Anand and Anand. This series would run into 4 weeks in the month of October 2020. So on each Saturday from today, that is October 10th, the Leap 2 would be on October 17th, Leap 3 on October 24th, and Leap 4 on October 31st, 2020. The timings would be same. As today's session would be moderated by Ms. Riddhi Bajaj, I would just hand over the baton to Ms. Riddhi to explain the rules of housekeeping to all. And before that, I would request all the panelists so that they can turn on their video mode on so that the August gathering can have them among us. Thank you very much. Over to you, Ms. Riddhi.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ravani, for the warm welcome. Now, like Dr. Ravani just said, to maintain the continuity and flow of the session, we would request you all to keep yourself muted at all times. All your questions will be taken up at the end of the session. You may raise your hand and the organizers will provide you with an opportunity to address your questions to the panelist. Our topic for discussion today is understanding the basics of patent litigation. We have three experienced intellectual property litigators with us today who will help us understand the concept and rationale behind the patent law in India. Our panelists will be speaking on the underlying concepts of patent law and will share their experiences in the field over the years, which will simplify and help us all understand the very basics and realities of patent litigation. Interestingly, all three of our panelists were part of the widely reported and contested matter, Monsanto versus Nosy Veedu, before the Supreme Court of India. Now, let me first introduce my three panelists with you. Mr. Dhruv Anand, he is a partner with Anand & Anand and an alumnus of George Washington University. His practices focuses on IP litigation and dispute resolution for all forms of intellectual property, including trademarks, copyright, patents, design, and domain names. He has successfully represented several well-known clients from various industries, ranging from pharmaceuticals such as Bayer, Pharmacyclics, Novo Nordisk, to various luxury brands like Louis Vuitton, Christian Louboutin, Tommy Hilfiger, etc., and has also represented various artists and campaigned for the Indian Singers' Right Association before court. Mr. Shravan Chopra, he's a partner with Anand & Anand and is an intellectual property litigator with over 13 years of experience in domains of IP. He obtained his Masters of Law from Franklin Pierce Law Center in the year 2008. He regularly appears before the Intellectual Property Appellate Board, the High Court, and Supreme Court. His experience has contributed to the development of jurisprudence of intellectual property in India. He has been counsel in several landmark patent cases, such as F. Hoffman La Roche versus Cipla, Dr. Aloy Warbin versus Yogesh Mehra, famously known as the Enocon case, among several others. Our third panelist, Mr. Vibhav Mittal, he is a managing associate with the litigation team of the firm. and an alumnus of the prestigious Boston University School of Law. He practices in diverse areas of intellectual property and has also been a part of the path-breaking decisions in the field of patent law, such as Ferry-Delaunay versus Union of India, Roche versus Cipla, and several others. Now, before we commence our session, and I will leave the floor to the panelists, you guys must have read in the news these days daily that there's an entire debate triggered around the COVID-19 vaccine, which all of us are eagerly awaiting for. So whether a patent should be to this vaccine that comes out, whether it should not be granted. Now, in order to carefully understand the nuances around the debate, let us first try and understand that what is a patent and why, in the first place, should a monopoly be granted to the patent holder. Mr. Anand, can you please explain to our audience what is the rationale behind the granting of a patent and why is it important that the rights of a patent holder be protected? Over to you, Mr. Anand.
Thank you, Riddhi, for the introduction. Hello to all the students, all the practitioners, whoever, Dr. Avanle, whoever's helped organize this event. The topic, of course, is an extremely interesting one, and we'll try and demystify a very complex and technical subject, which can take multiple seminars to even kind of touch the surface sometimes. But we'll try and demystify it as much as we can. Riddhi, I think, has begun with the most appropriate question: why a patent? I remember in the US in law school, we spent multiple classes just on this topic, so that certain professors who were extremely pro-patent would want this ingrained in the students' head of why patent protection, because unless you don't feel for it and don't have that passion to protect patent rights, you often face difficulty in court. So jumping straight into it, why a patent? And my fellow panelists, Shravan Chopra and Vibhav Mittal, will supplement me and add whatever I have missed. But essentially, the entire patent system is based on a patent bargain. Typically, all throughout the world, the term of a patent is 20 years, generally speaking. There are a few exceptions here and there, but those are aberrations. Patent protection is calculated in different ways, but typically the rule is that it's from the date of filing an application. Of course, under the PCT route, there is a date of international filing, and that's when the term of the patent starts running. Now, this is a very strong monopoly, 20-year monopoly. You may notice that it's a shorter term as compared to a copyright, which is typically for a literary artistic work, at least, sound recordings differ, is 60 years post-mortem auctoris, which is during the subsistence of the life of the author and 60 years after his death. Trademarks, as you know, are forever. If you just, abide by paying the renewal fees and maintenance fees, you can have a trademark forever, so long as it doesn't lose its distinctiveness. But a patent term is a shorter 20-year term. Therefore, it becomes very important to reward the patentee for his innovation during that 20-year term, and in a very strict manner. And that is why under patent law, there are a few exceptions that would exempt infringement, but not as varied and as diverse as you would see in copyright law, for example, where if all of you know Section 52 in the Copyright Act, which has various fair use provisions, probably 16 or 17. Having said that, there are certain exceptions built in the Patents Act as well, which we'll get into a little later, very broadly. But as I said, the entire patent system is based on a bargain. What is that bargain? The bargain is that a patentee invents a new product or a new process, which is new, which means it's novel in patent nomenclature. It involves an inventive step, meaning that it is not obvious to a person skilled in the art, and we'll get into these terms a little later on. But the three limbs required under section 2(1)(j) are that it has to be new, which means it should not exist before the patent application is filed. It should not be in use. Number one. Number two, it should not be obvious, which means basically it should not be trivial. And the whole obviousness law was built on the premise that immaterial or trivial variations will not receive patent protection. And the third is that it must have some practical utility. And of course, we'll get into that and how courts have interpreted utility. But it must at least be capable of some industrial application. It should not just be abstract and in somebody's head. Now, if a patentee is granted a patent by the sovereign, the state, in return, the patentee bargains to disclose the description of the invention in full. So that is the bargain that is struck. The government says, okay, we will grant you a strong 20-year monopoly, but in return, please disclose sufficiently how the patent is going to work, how you will enable others, typically a hypothetical person called, a person skilled in the art, which is a legal fiction, and I'll get into that later, and my fellow panelists will also, to enable them to practice the invention and make and use the invention. And I think the whole rationale and basis of that is that the moment the 20-year finishes, the technology, which is the subject matter of the patent, falls in the public domain. And then people can build that from that technology and build on that creative corpus and come up with something new and better. Although I must say that even while a patent is under subsistence, people can still make improvements to that patent so long as they don't infringe that patent, which means people can take licenses if they're making improvements, which of course include the basic patent. So that is the bargain that is struck, and that's very important to keep in mind, because we have seen in court and a lot of contentions issues where many times a patent is attacked on the point that the bargain is not being faithfully met by the patentee. Although he's obtained a patent and is commercializing the patent and is earning from the patent, he has not sufficiently disclosed a description of the patent and the best way of making and performing it. That's the bargain. I can hand over to Shravan and Vibhav if they wanted to add something to that.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and hope everyone's doing well and is safe in these trying times. I think Dhruv has covered everything very well. Just to add on to something that Dhruv said, that the term of the patent is 20 years from the date of application, as he correctly said. But in practice, what happens is a number of years are lost during the prosecution stage of the patent itself. So on an average, it will take probably up to 10 years for a patent to be granted in certain fields. In certain fields, it should take probably lesser. But that the grant of the patent doesn't give you the right to commercialize. It is a negative right, and that right is there to prevent others from impinging on your territory. Your territory in a patent is demarcated by the claims as granted. So practically speaking, as Dhruv correctly said, it's 20 years, but the term of the monopoly, because of the time taken during patent prosecution, becomes considerably lesser. And of course, if you do not have patents, how do you progress as a society? For example, you need to encourage innovation, but you can only encourage innovation if somebody is putting in money and innovating and putting in effort, and he doesn't get rewarded, then there will be no further research and development or innovation. And thus, patents are essential for an economy like ours and for a country like ours to progress further. That's all I just wanted to add on what you said. Over to you, Vibhav.
Right, sir. So, sir, as we all understand that under the Indian regime, we're all governed by the Indian Patents Act. So what are the legal requirements which are contemplated under the Act for grant of a patent? Can you explain to our audience here, who mostly students, what does the Patent Act contemplate for granting of a patent? Like Mr. Anand just mentioned about obviousness and anticipation. Can you briefly tell us students, what are these requirements under the Act?
Sure. So, as Dhruv correctly said, there's a holy trinity, 3 elements. One is it should be novel and not anticipated, which will come under Section 2L of the Indian Patents Act. The second element is, which is, as Dhruv said, should not be trivial, is that it should not be obvious to a person of ordinary skill in the art. Now, our Indian Act says it should have technical advancement or economic significance. So, for example, even if there is you can also get a patent if there's significant reduction in cost, because the words used under 2(1)JA are technical advancement or economic significance or both. So that's one. That's the second element of the Holy Trinity. And as Dhruv said, the third element being capable of industrial application. Now there's a distinction between that's under 2(1)AC, distinction between capable of industrial application and commercial use. Capable of industrial application means, as has been held by various Indian courts, right from the FHNB versus Unichem judgment of the Bombay High Court in 1969, that it should, the promise that the specification sets out, it should meet that promise. But that doesn't mean that you have to commercialize it. And one of the leading cases which is followed world over for this principle is the Thomas Edison case regarding the lamp, where a defense was taken by a defendant that we are making an improvement over what Mr. Edison has a patent over, and Mr. Edison's patent is not the commercial product, to which the courts in the United Kingdom held that it has to be capable of industrial application or utility. It does not have to be commercial utility. So there's a distinction. These are the 3 elements that you need to satisfy. And once you satisfy this, subject to the other considerations under the Act.
All right, sir. So we understand that the invention is only supposed to be capable of industrial application. Now, Mr. Mittal, can you elaborate and can you explain why ideas cannot be patented under the regime? And can you please also elaborate on what is specifically not patentable under the Act?
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone is doing safe and well in these times. This is an interesting discussion, and Riddhi, you've brought up a very interesting point. You know, generally we tend to say that patents are for ideas, but the interesting aspect is what you're asking is something which relates to patent eligibility. Patent eligibility is a concept in Section 3 of her Act, which says that what are aspects that do not qualify as inventions, and there are various clauses given in that. And coming specifically to your question about an idea, so an abstract idea is actually not patent eligible. One of the interesting references in that context is the Bilski case in the US, where you had an invention in which you were protecting buyers and sellers, and you were protecting them in the energy market against the risk of price changes. And the US court said that you cannot, that's an abstract idea and you cannot claim a patent on it. It's not patent eligible. Just to clarify for our listeners, like my co-panelists Dhruv and Shravan highlighted, the Trinity test is novelty, inventive step, capable of industrial application, which related to elements of patentability, whereas in Section 3 we're talking about patent eligibility. An abstract idea, your question, whether an idea can be a patent, falls within that. So like I said, Bilski said that an abstract idea is not patent eligible. Then we had a bit of case laws in that direction, and one interesting case in that is also the Alice case. The Alice case of 2014 of the US Supreme Court, which came up with a 2-step process to kind of demystify this idea of when an abstract idea becomes, when it moves away from being ineligible subject matter and moves towards being something that could be granted a patent. And there's a two-step test for that. One is that obviously whether is the claim drawn to an ineligible concept, and step two, very simply, is whether the elements of a claim, and as my co-panel pointed out, claim is what defines the scope and bound of the invention, whether the elements of the claim are sufficient to transform the claimed abstract idea into an inventive concept. The inventive concept is something that we'll touch in the discussion further. So the thing is whether the abstract idea gets transformed, whether it has elements, whether you've built on the abstract idea in order to transform it into an inventive concept, which can make it fall within the Trinity test, or which makes it fall within the rigors of the Patents Act. On this point, like Dhruv pointed out, there are provisions that you should comply with in the Patents Act. And like supposing Section 7 says that the patent is for one invention only, and then Section 10, as Dhruv pointed out, will talk about the fact that you have to fully describe the invention and method of operation. You have to tell what is the best method of making it, and you have to end with claims which define the scope of the invention. So Vriddhi, what you've asked is actually taking us into the heart of Section 3, and I'd like to now ask my co-panelists, because this provision, there are some cases that have happened, and I'd like to just hand it over to my co-panelists to elaborate further, please.
So if I may just add on what Vibhav just said, and I just wanted to add it because this seems contextual. So the point that I wanted to make was, and where Shravan left off as well, was that apart from the requirements under the Act of novelty, industrial application, and non-obviousness, we must also keep one principle in mind, and we see this play out in court, and my fellow panelists will attest to that, is that simplicity is no bar to patentability. That's very important, because some inventions in hindsight, which is a different concept, which we'll get into later, may seem to be very simplistic and very obvious, but they are breakthrough inventions. They actually revolutionize an industry. For example, without going into specifics, a simple tongue and groove mechanism for a flooring product, a wooden flooring that we often see in the house. They have a snap fit mechanism. That is something that in hindsight appears quite obvious, but it has revolutionized the industry, because what it does is that it ensures that dust doesn't settle in between the crevices, and there's a better fit that it maintains. It's a leading product in the world. There's another example of a laminating company, and they figured out, or rather they encountered a problem while printing, big maps. Small papers, they could laminate very easily, but they could not print out big maps because, certain wrinkles would get caused while the lamination process took place. All they did was they took out, a spindle from which the printing was happening. They made a little curvature to the spindle and covered it with, the plastic for protection. And that caused the problem. So now this is the question that's often debated theoretically, is do these inventions also deserve patents? Our contention is that of course they do, because had they been so obvious, they would have definitely been made before. And the fact that there was a problem in the industry, an unsolved need, which has not been addressed, certainly indicates to the fact that patents should be granted. And as Shravan said, the whole premise is that you need to incentivize innovation. Otherwise, nobody is going to invest. And we see that becomes most relevant during the COVID times. The whole world is racing towards a vaccine. Of course, we've already seen companies like AbbVie say that their vaccines are going to be, magnanimously given without them profiting. But just think of other companies. Why would they want to invest so much money and resources if they can't recoup their investments? So it's very important that they get strict monopoly rights of protection for a period of 20 years. Just one more quick point is that patent protection in certain industries are extremely critical. And I've got a couple of figures which I thought were very interesting from a book that I just, which I'm reading right now, is that in the last 60 years, 60, there have been only 1022 drugs that have been discovered, that have been invented. 1022. I mean, whatever the average is. But definitely over the past 60 years, that just shows what the amount of research that goes in. But look at the level of failure in these industries. And why would companies invest with that level of failure and such if they're not, they don't recoup their investments? It takes on an average 10 years for a drug to be developed. On an average, $1 to $2 billion for one drug to come out in the market. Some 10,000 drug candidates have to be eliminated before one drug comes out. Just look at that body of research. And when those people don't get incentivized and given patent protection, I think that's unfair. That's all. I just wanted to add that.
Correct.
Thank you, sir. So from what we understand, that this drug discovery and the process of coming with a particular invention or technology is very time consuming and requires a lot of investment. At the same time, there are, like you said, there are simple inventions which are also patentable and there's no bar. So in light of this background that we have, could you please elaborate from what we all must be aware of the famous Novartis decision, which talks essentially about the Section 3D criteria on the bar to patentability of inventions, and mostly it's regarding pharmaceutical drugs and inventions that we've seen that they're denied protection because of this bar, that there is nothing new that is coming out of it. So could you just introduce this concept to our students and make them understand in simple terms what this bar really is?
Sure. Thank you, Riddhi. Of course, the Novartis judgment, if any of you have read it, is extremely lengthy, and there are multiple issues discussed in that judgment. And I think the entire law of patents is in a way encapsulated and spoken of in that judgment. So it's a refresher course on patent law if anybody wants to have one, to read Roche, Merck, Novartis, judgments like that. But having said that, as far as this provision is concerned, it has to be read in the right context. Essentially, what the provision says is that a new form of a known substance is not patentable under Section 3D unless there is some enhanced efficacy shown. The case before the Supreme Court was that Novartis, for their famous Gleevec product, had filed an application which for beta crystalline form, which is a polymorph of imatinib mesylate. They had a previous patent called the Zimmermann patent in America, and in that, in a previous judicial proceeding, it was held that the Zimmermann patent actually disclosed imatinib, and by inference, imatinib mesylate as well. Although the claim there was for imatinib and all its pharmaceutically acceptable salts, the question was whether mesylate was disclosed. The court said, yes, it is disclosed. In India, the patentee sought to argue that this polymorphic version is a new form. It's something which is new. It's a new invention. It has various beneficial properties over the Zimmermann patent. It has better flowability, better storage, better bioavailability, which is how it works in the blood and for how long, and how much of it is required to, for example, deal with a toxic element in the blood. The court basically held, and without going to very deep analysis, that Section 3D is applicable, which bars inventions which are new forms of a known substance. Therefore, there was a specific finding that imatinib is a known substance. That's very important to know. And because Novartis came up with a new form of a known substance. This patent was hit by Section 3D. Now, you may ask, what is a new form? Section 3D is very clear, and in fact, Patents Act with me, but without referring much to it, it talks of salts, isomers, polymorphs, and things like that. So they're quite specific and quite explicit. The court said that yes, in this particular case, this being a polymorphic version of imatinib, which was a known substance, it falls within Section 3D. But still, Novartis could have obtained a patent had they shown that this polymorphic version showed enhanced efficacy. So the court then went to the question of what is enhanced efficacy. Basically, the court said that for pharmaceuticals, enhanced efficacy would mean therapeutic efficacy. Therapeutic means would mean therapy, right? Which means something that is curative, which works better in the body. Not flowability or better, shelf life for a product. The court said that these would not, these attributes and these characteristics would not show enhanced efficacy, but because for drugs, there has to be enhanced therapeutic efficacy. So they went into that question. And ultimately, the Supreme Court appeal was dismissed. We often see in various litigation this question come up, where defendants, especially in pharmaceutical, in fact, mostly in pharmaceutical matters, take up this Section 3 patent eligibility defense. And it's still being argued in court. And we've seen a few judgments, but we're bound to see many, many more right now. But it's very important to know before I leave, and my fellow panelists can add, that this provision does not apply for a new chemical entity, something which has been found for the first time in nature, first time made by man. So if somebody makes something new, so if somebody makes something new for the first time, which did not exist in nature, then 3D is not applicable, because it clearly says it's a new form of a known substance or a new use of a known substance, which is prohibited. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Anand. Now, Mr. Mittal and Mr. Chopra, would you like to add to what just Mr. Anand said and other restrictions and bars which are there under the Patents Act?
Right. Hi. So one other one that I wanted to highlight, which is part of the Monsanto decision, was Section 3J. Now, for our students here, Section 3J is again a patent eligibility provision which bars plants, animals, parts thereof, seeds, varieties, or species, essentially biological processes, for the production and propagation of plants. As you'll be aware, the Monsanto decision is actually sub judice before the single judge. But simply put, what happened in the Supreme Court was that in the division bench, the order against which we reached the Supreme Court, the division bench had found the invention in the Monsanto case as attracted by Section 3J. The division bench simply said that Section 3J applies. That finding was set aside by the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has sent the matter back to the single judge and has kept all issues of law open. So from a legal perspective, the interpretation of 3J is still open. But one takeaway from the Monsanto decision, and because of extensively how 3J was argued, one important takeaway in the Monsanto decision of the Supreme Court is the Supreme Court held that summary adjudication of a patent infringement suit, of a technically complex patent infringement suit, of patent infringement suits, is neither permissible or desirable in law. What the Supreme Court is emphasizing was that because patent infringement suits are technically complex and you have to lead expert evidence to prove infringement and everything, it's desirable to not do summary adjudication of the same.
So just to add to what Dhruv and Vibha said, they've covered Section 3D and Section 3J. I'll quickly just cover a bit of section 3K, which is very relevant for our software industry because we as a country are very big on software. So section 3K of the Act prohibits patents on mathematical or business methods or computer programs per se. The relevant words after computer program are per se because initially before 1999, before the Joint Parliamentary Committee, it used to just say computer programs. The words per se were added by the JPC, the Joint Parliamentary Committee, in the year 1999. This has been a very hot topic, and now the Delhi High Court has come up with a judgment in December 2019, which I believe is a watershed moment for this section. Because the Delhi High Court has categorically said that even if it is a computer program, if it has technical effect and has technical contribution, it is patentable subject matter. Most importantly, why the Delhi High Court has said this is very apparent from the judgment itself, which says that in every sphere of our life, in every little device that we have, is some sort of a computer program. To simply say anything which has got to do any relation to a computer program will per se not be patentable under section 3K, despite qualifying the elements of section 2 will not be correct. Now, this was an order passed by the writ court. It wasn't an order passed in a suit, and this emanated from a writ petition filed against the order of the IPAB, whereby the IPAB did not grant the patent. Thereafter, the matter was remanded back to the Patent Office, who again did not grant the patent. The matter was further carried forward and appealed to the IPAB, and on the 20th of August 2020, the IPAB has set aside the order of the Patent Office on merits and has granted the patent because, according to the IPAB, the Patent Office did not understand or did not comprehend properly the tenor and the intention of the Delhi High Court order. So this, we believe, will open up a lot of innovation, will encourage people to innovate more in the software industry, and for everything related to a computer program, as long as you satisfy the test of technical contribution and technical effect, you will be granted a patent. And there are various examples of technical contribution or technical effect. Supposing if something is more economical, takes lesser speed, consumes lesser bandwidth. These are all factors which actually show a technical effect, which will make the invention patentable subject matter. So these are the three cases broadly which have really been in the limelight for as regards section 3. So if Dhruv or Vibha would like to add anything.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Anand, would you like to add something to this? From what we understand, basically, that there's a trinity that we first need to satisfy that the invention has to be novel, it has to be non-obvious, it should be capable of industrial application. And then we also have to meet the bars which are set under the patent law under section 3, which our panelists have discussed, like section 3D, section 3J, section 3K, where per se we cannot get a patent for just a new form of a known substance unless we show that yes, there has been enhanced therapeutic efficacy. Like Mr. Chopra just said, there is a technical contribution in the software programming. So we understand that yes, now this is how we can obtain a patent. But now one thing, Mr. Chopra, like if a patent holder comes to you and he says that his product is being manufactured by another seller using his technology. So as a patent counsel, what would your advice be to him? What are the remedies that he can think of or he can avail under the patent law regime?
Sure. So the rights of a patentee are defined under section 48 of the Indian Patents Act. It is a negative right which prevents third parties from using, manufacturing, offering for sale, etc., the patented invention. So, and the boundaries of what you have is defined by the claims of the patent as granted. So the first and foremost thing is what your rights are. Your right is not a positive right to make. It is a right to prevent others from infringing. That's one. The remedies that are there in our Act are governed by Section 108, which is the final remedy, which a court can grant a permanent injunction. It can grant permanent injunction after, of course, trial, evidence and trial and cross-examination, permanent injunction, damages, or rendition of accounts. It's between damages and rendition of accounts. But before that, there's another remedy which is available to a patentee, which is the remedy of an interim injunction. An interim injunction can be of three kinds. Number one, it can be an ex parte ad interim injunction, where it's an ex parte proceeding where the defendant is not represented. The second is an ad interim injunction, where the defendant is represented and short arguments take place and a decision is rendered. Or it can be an interim injunction, a full interim injunction, which will operate till the conclusion of the trial and the suit, which is after the pleadings and everything is complete. And that's when that is heard by the court. Now, what are the requirements for an interim injunction? Again, it's a three-pronged test. One, the plaintiff has to make out a prima facie case. The plaintiff also has to show that the balance of convenience is in favor of the plaintiff. And thirdly, and most importantly, that irreparable harm and injury will be caused to the plaintiff if the defendants are not restrained from violating the plaintiff's patent. So this is the broad overview and relief that a court may grant. Of course, the interim injunction is governed by the Code of Civil Procedure under Order 39(1) and 2, whereas a final judgment is governed by Section 108 of the Indian Patents Act. So those are the remedies that are available to a patentee.
Mr. Chopra, just one quick thing. As we all are aware, yes, we can get an ex parte, like you mentioned, ex parte ad interim injunction. But for our audience here who are young students who are to come to practice, so the bar or the threshold for obtaining an ex parte injunction because the defendant hasn't entered appearance on the first day, would that ordinarily be very high? And
So
how?
it will all depend on the facts and circumstances of the case. As you know, an interim injunction is a remedy in equity. And so the court will be balancing equities before granting or refusing any sort of an order. So it will all depend on the facts and circumstances of the case and how the court can balance equities in the court's opinion.
All right. Thank you so much. Now, Mr. Anand, like Mr. Chopra just said, what are the remedies and the reliefs which are available? So for you as a patent lawyer, when you institute a lawsuit for patent infringement and your client comes to you with a query, so what are the information and documents that you will look into before filing of this patent infringement suit? Because from what we understand, it's a very technical and a very complex subject per se, which of course you are here to simplify and tell our students here. But as a patent lawyer with so many years of experience in the field, what is a sort of a checklist and what are the pre-litigation diligence that you carry out and what is essential for instituting a suit?
Right, thank you. So the first thing as a patentee that you must have your homework ready with is which patent are you going to assert? Because if you don't have a granted patent, then you can't sue for infringement, as you all know. Therefore, it's very important to identify which patent are you suing on. That's one. Why I say that is because, of course, at times there's only one patent that a company is granted, which they may or may not be commercializing at that particular time. But in certain industries, there may be multiple patents that may be granted covering a particular product. And because of that, sometimes strategically, there has to be a validity analysis that patent attorneys do to try and see how strong the patent will hold up in court. That's, of course, point number one, which patent to sue on. Number two, where are you going to sue? Of course, sorry, before that, who are you going to sue? So therefore, you must identify who a defendant is. What are they doing? Vibhav spoke of this, of claims and certain, how the claims are structured and the parts of claims, etc. What's important to know, and this is quite a cardinal principle in patent law, is that to establish infringement, each and every element of the claim must read on to the accused device. So if somebody is infringing a patent on my mobile phone, then each and every element of the claim, which may consist of 3 or 4 elements, must read on to the infringing device. That's quite a cardinal principle. There is an exception where somebody may try and circumvent by adding something trivial to the accused device or immaterial, and you have the doctrine of equivalence that prohibits that kind of activity, because the court then looks into whether that added variable in fact changes the invention, or does it only try to circumvent and infringe by copying the essence of the invention. So what I'm trying to get at is that you need to show that each of these elements of the claim are in fact copied. How do you show that? You can show that in a simple case where, for example, I have a patent on a pharmaceutical compound like ibrutinib, which is used for treating cancer. In that particular case, often the task becomes quite easy because the defendants admittedly, in their literature or through their websites say that they are in fact using ibrutinib. So that's an admission, and that's quite easy. But it becomes more complex in cases of formulations, for example, when you have a patent over A plus B plus C plus D, and in what quantities and in what proportions, then you may have to show, carry out tests in the laboratory or otherwise to figure out whether the infringing formulation in fact has each one of those elements of the claim. Another cardinal rule, patent law, is that each claim exists independently. So there is a provision in the Patents Act 114 that says that a patent, even if all claims fall, as long as one claim is standing, the patent can be declared to be valid. So each claim defines the metes and bounds of a new inventive concept, or rather new embodiment in each separate claim. The inventive concept may be the same as Weber was saying, but each claim has a separate embodiment. So without getting into too much specifics, it's like an inverted pyramid. The broadest claim is first, and then it gets narrowed down and keeps narrowing down. That's why the inverted pyramid. And even if one claim survives, a patentee is successfully able to assert that, and if the patentee is able to show infringement, then the patentee succeeds. So I've already covered these aspects. A lot of times you see patentees actually show claim charts to show that the infringing features are in fact being used by the defendant. So in complaints or plaints, what we call them under the CPC, claim charts are produced, and that's quite essential to sometimes to show patent infringement. There are other things that you look at, like whether the patent is being worked in India or not. Shravan touched upon, the 3 requirements to obtain an interim injunction: a prima facie case, balance of convenience, and irreparable injury. Sometimes working may become a factor in deciding balance of convenience, whether a court should grant an injunction or not. It's not a sole criteria or determinative, but there are various factors that the court has to weigh to see where the balance of convenience lies, whether it lies in granting an injunction or not. Similarly, and therefore we have to, in our plaint, oftentimes show that the patent is being worked in the country in significant commercial quantities, and there's a procedure by which you file forms before the patent office saying that these are the quantities in which it is being worked. Of course, if there are confidential figures, that there's a provision to keep that confidential. So we satisfy ourselves on working. That's one. Although working is not mandatory, you can still get an injunction without the patent being worked, so long as you are taking preparatory steps to somehow commercialize the patent during its term. We satisfy ourselves on working, on jurisdiction, where to sue. That's a big question, because you may have a patentee may have multiple options. We've seen that the Delhi High Court has been leading and quite in the forefront when it comes to patent laws. The Bombay High Court and Chennai High Court are exceptionally savvy when it comes to patents as well. But the majority, or 70% of the litigation we've seen in pharmaceutical patents, especially post 2005 when the product patent regime came in, is before the Delhi High Court. So where to sue? Of course, if Delhi has the jurisdiction, it's a preferred forum of choice. Working of the patent, claim charts, if you can buy a sample of an infringing product. Of course, if you're suing on a telecom technology, an ICT technology, what you call information communication technologies, on an antenna, you can't go and purchase an antenna and produce it in court and say that's the infringing. But you can certainly purchase a drug. You can purchase an infringing sample of, let's say, a telephone. Sometimes, obtaining a product is quite beneficial as well. I think these are broadly the things that we look at while advising a client, before filing a patent suit.
Thank you. Another thing, Mr. Chopra, if you could just elaborate of key ultimate action. That patent may not be a mandatory criteria for filing an action for patent. Likewise, if you receive an information that, okay, the product of the infringing product, which is using your technology, is not yet placed in the market, but there's an apprehension that will soon be launched in the market, can you move the court and can you file for a relief for patent infringement in that case?
Yes, in one word, yes, absolutely. Now, our Patent Act itself, under Section 48, prohibits somebody from even offering for sale, which in itself is an inbuilt quiet timid action. Now, quiet timid actions have been recognized world over, and it's not something which is just new. In India, the first case on a quiet timid action was way back in 1954, and that too by the Patna High Court in a patent matter. They've all been following the UK decision in Pearson versus Lowe, and thereafter even our Act prohibits an offer for sale, and hence you can approach the court where you apprehend an injury, because quiet timid basically means I'm apprehending an injury and I'm coming to you before I get injured. So the court surely has the power to grant orders to protect somebody's intellectual property for in a quiet timid action, and specifically under Section 48 of the Patents Act, where offering for sale is also prohibited.
All right, thank you so much. Mr. Mittal, can you just quickly tell us that, like Mr. Anand touched upon, that we have to first identify where we can file a suit. So in case of a patent infringement suit, is there any specific provision under the statute, like the Trademark and the Copyright Act, which gives an additional territorial jurisdiction, or do we follow the simple regime under Section 20 of the CPC?
Thank you, Riddhi. Thank you for the question. So yeah, so we've discussed release. We've discussed what happens when what happens if a person comes with a suit of infringement. This is again this question is kind of giving a broad structure to what my Dhruv and Shravan has said before. So in a patent suit, it is unlike trademark and copyright, where you have a criminal remedy. In a patent suit, under the Patents Act 1970, which governs the thing, is substantive law, there's only a civil remedy. Then Section 104 of the Act says that it should not be lower than the district court. It also, the proviso of that says that if the defendant, there's a further qualification, that when I say it's not lower than district court, there's a further qualification, if the defendant in the suit files a counterclaim. Now, counterclaim for students, just to clarify, is a countersuit. It's provided in the CPC, I think Order 8 Rule 6A or something. There's a counterclaim, which you need to file a countersuit. So if I have sued a plaintiff for infringement, then the defendant could counterclaim, could countersue for, say, challenging the validity of the patent, which is asserted in the suit. Which, if you're filing a lawsuit, one of the key aspects is determining which patent to assert. So we've asserted a patent, and the defendant then files a counterclaim to challenge the validity of the said patent. So if you file a counterclaim, then then as per section 104, instead of district court, it goes to a high court. Then the contours of what the suit, what rights the patent owner has, my co-panelist Dhruvin Shavan have already spoken about that. It's section 48, and it's couched as a negative right. And the interesting part about patents and generally about is that or general IP also is that there are certain courts that have original jurisdiction. Original jurisdiction, simplifying it really for all the students here, original jurisdiction, you can take it as the court of first instance or where you start the lawsuit. So there are certain high courts that have been given original jurisdiction, like Delhi, Calcutta, Bombay, Chennai, and Shimla, 5 that are covered. So that's where you have an option of instituting it in these 5 courts, or you can go to a district court. Usually in patent litigation, what we've seen is that in 2015, the government introduced a Commercial Courts Act, which recognized, and I'm just briefly touching upon here, and my co-panelists will take this forward, is that just to contextualize this, because we have original jurisdiction, and on top of original jurisdiction, we have a Commercial Courts Act. What it did was it recognized intellectual property. If students would see, I think section 2 of that act, I think section sub 17th category, I think it recognizes IPR as a special category of disputes. So it elevated or recognized IP as a special type of dispute, and it made certain amendments to the Code of Civil Procedure. And therefore, the broader context in which patent litigation works is, just to summarize this, is it's a civil remedy, not criminal. It's not lower than district court. If there's a counterclaim, you go to high court. There are 5 high courts that have original jurisdiction, and that is now supplanted with the Commercial Courts Act, which has the way it is functioning. I think we'd like to elaborate, give it to my co-panelists.
Thank you, Mr. Mittal. Mr. Anand, would you just quickly run through the defenses which are available in a case of a patent infringement to the defendant when you've sued him? What can he possibly come and argue that why is he not infringing the technology? In very simplified terms, because of course we understand this subject is very technical in nature, without running through the technicalities.
Right. Okay. So without going into technicalities, essentially there are certain broad defenses that we generally see crop up in patent litigation taken by the defendants, and the defendants are mentioned in section 64 of the Patents Act. And if you see the defenses, there are quite a few, but the ones that we often see are on lack of novelty, which is that the invention is not new, which means that it's been published in a publication before, or it's been in use before. We see that very, very often. We also see an obviousness attack, which is that although the invention may be new, but it's still obvious to a person skilled in the art. As I said earlier, who is a person skilled in the art is a very complicated question, and there's a history of probably 150 years of case law internationally in America, in England, and India has adopted heavily from this body of jurisprudence to say who this hypothetical construct or who this legal fiction is. Who is this ordinary person? It's very important to identify who a person of ordinary skill in the art is, because he is the notional addressee. He is the person to who the patent application or the granted patent is addressed to. So when the court has to make a determination whether a patent is in fact obvious, the court will look at it from the anvil and from the vantage point of a person skilled in the art. Who is a person skilled in the art? There are various yardsticks or indicators that the courts adopt to identify a person skilled in the art. So for example, in a given field of technology, a PhD may be a person of an average skill. A person skilled in the art must be a person of average skill. He must not be a genius. He must be somebody who is a person of ordinary skill in the art. We see an obviousness attack, very often. We also see a Section 8 defense, which is that there is an obligation on patentees before the grant of a patent to periodically inform the patent office of any equivalent patent applications filed in foreign patent countries. You have to periodically inform the patent office of that for the purposes of full candor and disclosure. And we often see a Section 8 attack taken as a defense because 107 of the Patents Act allows these grounds of revocation to be taken as a defense as well in an infringement suit. And a Section 8 attack is quite common. There are other defenses, but these are the most the most popular ones that we have seen.
Thank you so much. So moving forward from defenses, now that the party would have taken up defenses, and we understand that the procedure that's followed in a patent infringement suit is on the lines of what is directed under the Civil Code of Civil Procedure. So from the stages, we understand that trial will be led, and then final arguments will be heard, and then a judgment will be pronounced. So regarding the recent development since 2015, when the commercial courts regime was introduced, how has the patent infringement lawsuit been impacted by the introduction of the commercial court regime? Has the trial, which we all know that trial in Indian courts take up to several years to conclude, and then the matter is pushed in the finals, and then the final arguments take place, and it will practically take forever to decide the case, which sometimes might even exhaust the term of the patent. So how do we see that with the introduction of the commercial courts regime shaped up, and how has that led to speedy disposals of the patent infringement suit, especially keeping in mind the limited monopoly that is granted to a patentee to exploit his patent? Could you please share with your personal experiences over the years of practice what you would have seen, how the changes have come about under the commercial courts regime? Sorry, Mr. Anand, can you hear me?
Okay, I was just wondering whether that question is for me. Thank you. Yes, as you rightly said, that the Commercial Courts Act has revolutionized litigation in general before the Delhi High Court and other courts. One prominent feature that we've seen is that the lifespan of a litigation is considerably shrunk. Earlier in 2002, when there were major amendments to the Code of Civil Procedure, that shortened, a typical litigation from, I would say, 10 years to 5 years. I'm talking about a typical IP case. And when I mean 5 years, I mean from when the case is filed, arguments on the interim application, entering the trial, which is filing affidavits of your witnesses, cross-examination, final arguments. That would take, post 2002, it would still take 5 years, which is a very long period of time. And as you rightly said, that by that time, sometimes the term of the patent itself expires. So it becomes a very pyrrhic, a symbolic patent or right for the patentee, because he's then only fighting for damages because he can't get an injunction because the patent is expired. Post 2000, after 2015 of the Commercial Courts Act, now a litigation can actually conclude in a year and a half. Sometimes even a year. A year is also possible. And how does this happen? This happens through inbuilt mechanisms in the Commercial Courts Act. There are various things. For example, a lawsuit would be stuck at the stage of service for a very long period of time. When you file a suit, you may get an ex parte injunction if you have a good case, a prima facie case. But after the injunction is granted, that's only a temporary injunction. You must notify the defendant and serve the summons upon the defendant. And the defendant then comes and adduces his defense by way of a written statement. Or as Shravan said, they can even file a counterclaim if they haven't filed a previous revocation, attacking the validity of the patent itself. So not only a defense by way of a written statement, but even a counterclaim attacking the validity of the patent. They may do that. So what used to happen is after the suit was filed, because the defendant sometimes was some remote part of India or some other state, the plaintiff could not be able to notify the defendant with this, with the factum that the suit has been filed, and summons in the suit could not be served, and the suit would be stuck for 8 months. But now the court has enabled WhatsApp service, which is very, very helpful, because now even WhatsApp service, you can serve a defendant with summons on WhatsApp. That's one. Two, foreign witnesses need not come down from, let's say, Canada or America to adduce evidence or to depose or give testimony in a trial over here. They can even do it through video conferencing. So before, video conferencing has, attained a lot of significance now during the COVID times, but even before, and there are cases like Mattel, etc., where there was testimony, and this is very interesting, and I'll just take 30 seconds. The court said, okay, we can allow video conferencing, but with certain safeguards. So just see how they filtered and put safeguards. First, the lawyers were here in Delhi. The witness was somewhere in London. So the court said that the witness should first go to a consulate, like an embassy, to ensure that there is authenticity. And there should be that was the first requirement. Then the court said, okay, we'll dispel with that requirement. One person has to be sitting. A notary officer has to be sitting in front of the witness who's being cross-examined. That's a safeguard, so that nobody prompts the witness during cross-examination. Then the court said, okay, we'll dispel with that. Then we can have a wide angle camera, which means there should be a camera focusing on the witness, and it should basically pan with a panoramic view. It should pan across the room to see that, yes, there is nobody prompting him. So these are some safeguards the court adopted so that cross-examination can happen via video conferencing. That's very helpful, because a lot of times, witnesses are pretty prominent people in their field, in chemistry, biochemistry, biotechnology, and they're very busy. They usually, either with universities, and they often can't come to India, especially again and again. And so that's under the Commercial Courts Act, that's very, very useful. One last thing is that there are some timelines, maybe two, which are absolutely crucial. If you miss the bus there, then you miss the bus for good. For example, if you're a defendant and you don't file a written statement in 120 days, there's a Supreme Court judgment now, which has been followed by the Delhi High Court and all the other courts, which says that if it's 121 days from the date you received summons, then you forfeit your right to file your written statement. And to close a defendant's right to file a written statement is a very big thing, because then the evidentiary burden becomes far easier on the plaintiff, and he can prove his case with much ease, as opposed to there being a conflicting defense. So this 120-day period for written statements, very important. To a written statement, we file a replication, which is a reiteration of our complaint and a plaint, and whatever we have to answer new to the written statement. That must be filed within 45 days. Maximum 30 days typically, but an extension of 45 days. You miss the bus, there's a recent judgment of the Delhi High Court, Justice Kameshwar Rao, that says even if it's the 46th day, your right is gone. You cannot file a replication. And that might be quite damaging to the plaintiff. So these timelines have to be strictly followed, but I think it's better in the bargain for patentees, because now they can see, light at the end of the tunnel, and suits conclude quite swiftly and efficiently. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Thank you, Mr. Anand. Mr. Chopra, would you just want to discuss, and we have over 200 young budding students here. Would you just want to capture and tell them that what are the recent trends in patent litigation that we are all facing in court these days, and what are one of the most contentious, any one example that you could just tell our students here regarding the most contentious patent litigation in India?
There are quite a few, and since we are counsels in some of them, I don't know how much you will want to discuss those, but what is being litigated currently a lot are standard essential patents, the entire discussion around genus and species patents, and anti-suit injunctions. Now, besides this, another factor which is very important for a court to take into consideration was what was laid down by in the Roche v. Cipla judgment of the single judge, which is that of public interest. Because besides the three elements of prima facie case, balance of convenience, and irreparable harm and injury, the concept of public interest was introduced in 2008 following the eBay judgment in the US. And these four are the kind of arguments and the kind of things which the courts are grappling with right now. So these are the four hot topics, for lack of better words. And just to continue from where what Dhruv said, the Commercial Courts Act in conjunction with what is happening in virtual courts nowadays. For example, the Delhi High Court is taking up hearings over hundreds of hearings in a day. They are all on a WebEx platform. One great advantage is that one doesn't talk over the other in a virtual hearing, which would always happen in court. If the plaintiff's counsel would make a submission quickly, the defendant's counsel would pipe up and say something contrary to it. Now, that is one advantage of a virtual hearing. The courts are giving more time. The judges are actually giving more time because it's for lack of better word, it's a very well structured method by which matters are being heard. Cross-examination, as Dhruv said, is happening virtually. Even in COVID times where witnesses are overseas, cross-examinations are happening virtually. There are time slots. So, of course, people would know that the Joint Parliamentary Committee around 10 to 15 days ago has recommended, of course, whether what happens is a different case altogether, that all tribunals go virtual for good. Enabling, that means the NCLT, the NCLAT, the IPAB, Joint Parliamentary Committee has made that suggestion in a report given to the Parliament. And maybe the way things are functioning, you probably will have somewhere down the line a virtual bench always sitting in probably the Supreme Court or the High Court. So this is going to be this seems to be a hybrid model which is developing, and in conjunction with the Commercial Court Act, this will really expedite the entire process for a patentee or for a defendant for that matter who believes that they are not infringing or the patent is invalid. So these are the changes in the last 4 to 6 months which have really helped. Yes, Dhruv, please.
No, I think Shravan summed it up perfectly well. There are you asked about latest trends, and I just thought it'll be interesting to tell the students that we've seen a lot of litigation when it comes to confidentiality clubs. That's very interesting topic, and I'd urge everyone to, if they haven't read up on confidentiality clubs, to read on that, because, sometimes these technologies are so valuable that, there's very commercially sensitive information that has to be shared with the court. And so, the courts around the world have evolved with the mechanism to say, yes, you can form confidentiality clubs in a litigation, which means that only certain people are allowed access to documents filed or information that is shared in the litigation. And that we've seen, and essentially the litigation has been about the composition of the confidentiality clubs. Who will it be composed of? So, certain courts say that it can have external experts only. Certain courts say that it should have in-house counsels as well. Some people say even the lawyers can be. So there's no consensus right now, and that's being litigated, as Shravan said, in court quite often these days. The second thing is that just 2 days back, there was we all knew of an anti-suit injunction. But just 2 days back, in one of the cases in the Delhi High Court, there has been an anti-suit injunction. And it's quite interesting, without going and talking about the facts, although this is in the public domain, is that the Delhi, there was a suit filed, a declaratory suit filed in China, in Wuhan. And there was an anti-suit injunction obtained in China. The Delhi, basically saying that the plaintiff in the Delhi suit should not proceed with the infringement suit in Delhi. The Delhi High Court has now passed an anti-suit injunction, saying that the plaintiff is allowed to proceed with the suit over here.
Right.
And So that's something which I'd urge everyone to read up on. And of course, SEP litigation is just fascinating, and that's where the real development lies. I don't think we have time today, but it's quite a complicated domain of what standard essential patents are. Completely different paradigm, different considerations for SEP litigation. But we're going to see that a lot of growth in that space in the next few months, few years possibly.
Thank you so much, Mr. Anand. So we're already running short in time, and this brings us to the end of our session here. But just broad takeaways from this session. One which comes to my mind straight away as a budding litigator in this field is that you have to strictly comply to timelines. If you miss the bus, you miss the bus. There is no way coming around it. And I would just request my panelists to briefly just give us students who are all budding to become litigators in future and hopefully patent litigators, what should their takeaway from this session be? I understand that each subject that we touched upon during this session requires another session to itself, but just briefly encapsulating and giving them some motivation, what each of you would like to say. Mr. Mittal?
Thank you. I just want to make one point that patent litigation, if you don't have a technical background, it does not matter. Patent litigation, you can pick up, you can manage, you can figure it out. You just have to apply, work hard, be sincere, and you will find your way through it. I don't have a technical background, so I've been in patent litigation so many years, and I think that's a very important point the students should understand. Shouldn't close your mind towards it just because of the lack of thinking that's all technical.
Thank you. Mr. Chopra, what would you like to add to this?
I got disconnected for a bit, so I missed what was said.
We're just ending the session, and I would just like you 30 seconds to just share a few words with the students to encapsulate what we've discussed today and to motivate them to practice patent litigation in the future.
Right. So, of course, patent litigation is a broader subset of intellectual property litigation. I would encourage whoever is interested in the subject to not feel that patent litigation should not be, one can't do patent litigation because one doesn't have a technical background. That's one takeaway I would like to give, because you can work on a hybrid model where you can get support from somebody who's technically qualified. So don't shy away from patent litigation just because you think you don't have a science degree. That's just the takeaway I would like to give. Yeah.
Mr. Anand, quick 30 seconds.
Yes. So there's a big debate raging, and we've seen this in patent litigation. On one side of the coin is public interest, and one side of the coin is giving the patentee what the patentee deserves, full protection. How do you balance these two? I would, of course, really encourage everyone to look at both sides of the coin in any dispute in an objective manner. At times, one party is demonized to say that, this party is wrong. Look, a patentee is thwarting innovation. They're stopping people. They're going and filing injunctions, and availability of drugs is being hampered with. But do also see the other side of the kind of research that goes in, the kind of money that goes in, the kind of hard work, blood that goes into, the sweat that goes into making inventions which you and I use on a daily basis in everything that we do. Without those inventions, we would find it very difficult. So public interest, exceptionally important. That's why the basic patent system is premised on. At the same time, it should be balanced by giving fair protection to the patentee. That's my message, because the topic was patent law. And as Shravan rightly said, I don't have a science background, but we worked hard and in a hybrid model with patent engineers. And I would encourage everyone to please, take up patent law, and it's going to grow in a big way. And thank you, Dr. Remandle, and thank you everyone for listening so patiently and organizing this fantastic seminar, and Riddhi for moderating it so brilliantly.
Thank you so much. Now, we hope that this session was really informative and you were able to understand the basics of the patent law, and it will help in all of your future endeavors. Now, the floor is open to all of you for question and answers. As you all know, we're already hard pressed for time. Kindly restrict your questions to the scope of discussion today. You may please take your name and clarify whom you're pointing and addressing your question to. That will make it easier and quicker for all of us. Thank you.
So please raise your hand so that we can allow you to pose the question. Yes, Ms. Devangini Rai, please unmute yourself and ask your question. Ms. Devangini Rai, please unmute yourself and ask the question. Ms. Devangini, we cannot hear you. We'll go to the next. Mr. Girish Ahuja, please unmute yourself and ask the question.
Good afternoon to the panelists. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
So my question is for Dhruv sir. Sir, can the incorporation of a utility model law in an existing intellectual property rights regime prove beneficial for the SMEs in order to boost our economy, especially post-COVID?
Yes. So my short answer is yes, absolutely. We already have a semiconductor chip legislation that integrated designs on semiconductor chips which confers protection. According to me, more than getting new laws, I think we have sufficient laws, intellectual property laws, to cover any given area. There are concepts like passing off, which are non-statutory rights, they're common law rights. You don't need to invoke a statute for trademark infringement, for example. In patent law, there are concepts like purposive construction. Somebody doesn't have to literally infringe your claim. You can invoke those torts, like for example, on the internet, phishing, hyperlinking, spamming. Similarly, your question on utility models, there are laws prevalent, but yes, of course, to have a self-contained code dedicated to utility models is going to help. Yeah, that's what I'd say.
Oh, thank you, sir.
Yeah. Ms. Bhavya Sari, please unmute yourself and ask the question.
Good afternoon, panelists. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
First of all, I would like to thank you all for such an insightful session. It was truly insightful to gain the best knowledge from you, from the best in the industry. And thanks, Riddhi ma'am, for pointing such an interesting questions. Thank you. So my question is mainly for Dhruv sir, since you talked about the COVID vaccine patency in the initial phase. So sir, my question is that whether all the medicine should be provided a patent protection, let's say for a term of 20 years. Like, since my concern is like in the times of emergencies, like current COVID times, providing patent protection to the medicines would incur basically many of the, we could say, there would be many problems which the people could foresee, like let's say non-affordability of the medicine and even non-availability in the market. So sir, what's your stance on the same, like protecting them for a term of 20 years? Would it be good in the long run for the industry and also for the people, or should another, we could say, a term should be managed for them?
I think that's an exceptional question. It's a very, very good question, very relevant during these times. I'd say that there should be some degree of protection given to the people who innovate. But having said that, these are unprecedented times. And certainly in these situations, I don't even see patentees, trying to earn extraordinary profit from the medicines or vaccines or PPE kits or ventilators that they make. There are already companies who have made statements that they will give away, all profit, and they'll, just basically kind of sustain themselves by coming out with these products. Right. So I completely agree with you. Companies should be magnanimous, which they will be. Number one. Number two, I think the Patent Act itself has various provisions to ensure that the government can march in, or what you call march in rights, or the government can issue compulsory licenses to people without actually them asking for permission or authorization from the patent owners. Of course, there's a mechanism in the Patents Act for a reference to be made to the High Court to determine the royalty then in that case, but that's a different point. What I'm trying to say is that there should be a balance, but yes, in these times, public interest is extremely important, and maybe even truncate the term. I agree with you. Even the term can be truncated. Patent pools are there. There are various other mechanisms in place to ensure that patent rights don't don't thwart free availability of the product in reasonable quantities in the market.
Mr.
Just-
Chopra, want to add something?
Add to what Dhruv is saying, if you see the front runners in the vaccine development stage, Moderna said yesterday they are not going to assert the patent if it's granted. Oxford and AstraZeneca are doing the same. You take the example of Gilead, who's actually given a license to 7 companies in India to manufacture remdesivir. So, and of course, our country along with South Africa has gone to the WTO to say that, listen, even if patents are granted, don't enforce them for a year. So, people are not oblivious to the situation, but a right balance has to be struck, as Dhruv correctly said.
Right, sir. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Mr. Shwetang Nila, unmute yourself and ask the question.
Good afternoon, dear panelists. I hope I am audible.
Yes, you are.
Thank you so much, ma'am. My question is directed to Dhruv sir and Vibhav sir. I wish to ask if the degree of proof with respect to patentability of computer implemented inventions, which are more based on programs than other equipments, is more in relation to any other invention, or is it the same?
So I'll ask Shravan. Thank you for the question. Very relevant. I'll ask Shravan to take the lead because he was the lead counsel, handling that case along with Vibhav. So they'll be, more appropriate to answer that question. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much.
Can you just state your question again? Sorry.
So my question was: is the degree of proof to get a grant of patent with respect to computer implemented inventions, which is more based on programs than other significant IoTs, is the degree of proof more in such cases, or is it the same with respect to other inventions?
As long as you are not barred under 3K, and how do you get out of 3K? You show that it has a technical effect or a technical contribution. There are CRI guidelines published by our patent office. There were draft guidelines of 2013 and there are guidelines of 15 and 17 which say what technical effect and technical contribution is. There is Article 52 of the European Patent Convention, which will also lead you to that direction, along with the Symbian judgment and other things. So in a nutshell, if there is technical contribution and technical effect, it comes out of the realm of 3K and you will get a patent.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir. That was totally clear.
And just to add to that, I completely agree with Sean. And just because I think your question has two elements. One is the grant of the patent, which is what we said. And if you're talking about a civil suit, then the burden of proof is the same as, it's similar to what is there in the CPC. So there's no difference in that sense, in terms of technology.
Yes, sir. Actually, I wanted to know the same that Shravan sir had pointed out, that the 3Ks, which the 3 important pointers which have to be proven with respect to such inventions.
Right.
Thank you so much, sir.
Ms. Vidya Kakra, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Good afternoon, dear panelists. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
My question is directed to Mr. Anand. So my question is, owing to the rapid increase of the Make in India movement, what effects does the Innovation in India concept of the movement have on the strict patent regime, especially after COVID-19?
Right. So, what I understand the question to mean is whether there are what effect will the government's initiative, that is Make in India, have on the patenting system? Is that the question? Or I'm sorry, I didn't get the question exactly.
So yes, sir, my question is exactly the same.
Right. So of course, we've seen this is a time where people say over the past few years, there's an era of, earlier we saw an era of globalization. Now countries are turning in and becoming more nationalistic, and self-sufficiency is the new norm. And we've seen that in many, many countries. Make in India is a initiative by the government of India, which is a fantastic one, like all other initiatives, many other initiatives. And that will only increase, FDI inflow into the country, that will ensure that there is domestic manufacturers and producers will be given incentives to produce more. But at the same time, we've, what we talk about Atmanirbhar, it does not mean import substitution, right? It does not, because pre-1991, as you all know, we followed a different policy, and then we opened up after 1991 when India got liberalized. What the government is, I think, introduced now is not to say that they will not import. There are, medicines are going to be imported. There's transfer and technology is going to take place in a huge scale. But at the same time, Indian domestic manufacturing is going to be incentivized. It's going to be given a boost so that India exports more and imports less. There's no balance of payment problem. And as far as the patent structure is concerned, it'll only do good to the patent system, because then people will innovate. And once people innovate, they will find patent protection, sufficient patent, more and more people applying for more and more patents. It's going to spur further creativity and further innovation. So I think it'll only do good to India.
Right.
Yeah.
Am I audible now?
Yeah.
All right. So,
Yeah.
Dr. Raman, bring us to the end of our session.
Okay, so can we take one question, because Ms. Devangini, she was the first who asked the question, but she could not.
So I'm sorry, I wasn't able to unmute myself earlier.
Yeah.
Would it?
Please ask the
Ms.
question.
Devangini, can you just address your question, and the panelist who you were addressing to?
I would like to address my question to Mr. Mittal and Mr. Chopra. So both of these were part of the Ferrer-Lani victory, which was a landslide victory in August 2020. So my particular question is that the controller of patents did not initially allow the claim, and they were very strict in the judgment. They cited so many foreign judgments to prove that the patent claim is not qualified. Later on, they did ultimately pass the judgment. So do you think that the CRI guidelines, the CRI guidelines need an amendment in that technical effect definition? That would be my question. Thank you.
Okay, to put it very simplistically, of course, Vibhav will add to it. I believe that the controller of patent made a serious error in paragraph 31 of the order, because it misinterpreted the High Court's direction. The controller of patent said that the High Court has given a direction that the EPC Article 52 will overrule the CRI guidelines in India. And there were 6 guidelines given by the CRI in 2013 in the draft manual, which categorically said what amounts to a technical effect or a technical contribution. And once an error has been made which is so fundamental that it has applied the wrong law, that ought to be set aside. That's one. Coming to your question, if you want to encourage innovation, if you want to incentivize innovation, Of course, whether the CRI guidelines need amendment or not is a larger discussion where various stakeholders will also have to come in. But as of now, the way the IPAB has dealt with the order, according to us, is correct because of the error made by the Patent Office in its jurisdiction and in understanding the directions of the Delhi High Court. Viva, if you'd like to add anything to that.
No, I completely agree. Just that on the technical effect definition, that itself the Delhi High Court had observed the existing one in their order, and the IPAB in its order has referred to the existing guidelines as a sufficient guiding factor in terms of what technical effect is. So, like Shravan said, that if you want to rework on it, that's up to the domain and policy experts if you want to revisit that definition. But as things stand today, and the IPAB order and the Delhi High Court order, we have sufficient guidance to help understand what technical effect means.
Thank you so much, both of you. And I congratulate the team on securing a massive win to the country. Thank you so much.
So
Thank you.
here we come to an end. May I take 2 or 3 minutes to, because it is my duty that I should thank you all, not for just creating the opportunity, but rather giving us that impetus of thought that, you know, what they would like to become in life possibly. But the best thing, what Mr. Shravan, you took me back to my school days and you reminded me of Edison bulb, because people have forgotten the term bulb now. Earlier it was Edison bulb, and in India it was called to be Bajaj bulb, if you remember, because those were the advertisement we have seen. And we hardly see the word bulb because it is no more a term in the context of law. And if we see this change, a bulb then becoming a non-utility because it is replaced by some other innovation, and that is what we give or what we call as intellectual property and the law. And then again, another interesting words which were used by Mr. Dhruv, that you talked about discovery and invention. In our school days, we were taught that these are the words which matter. But when we came into the law school, then we come across that words don't matter, the terms matter. And discovery and invention, they don't become at all words, because discovery is what exists, you just figure it out. And invention is something which is innovative. You are the one who would figure it out first. So if Newton would have known that, nobody would have known Newton. But Newton, I always say that Newton was fortunate enough. By that time, hardly anybody had any idea. And he just said, I saw it and this is gravitation. But with due respect, I still respect Newton for that. And as a result, so Vibhav, you also were making certain points about that, why invention, and then what is the importance. Like as Mr. Shravan also said, and so Mr. Dhruv and Mr. Vibhav, you all say that if an innovator does not get an incentive, why would he, right? And this reminded me of a story which was, it's a Sufi story. I'm sorry, I like to tell story and relate them with law. But this story was shared with me by my father. He said he was with his guru, and the guru said, could you please switch that button? Could you please switch it on? It was dark in the evening, so he he put that switch on, and he said, oh, there is light. So the question asked by the guru was to my father, where did that dark go? Well, my father had no answer for that. My father said, okay, then Guruji asked, now could you please switch it off? He switched it off. And then there was darkness. And then he said that these are two sides of one. What you call darkness or the light. They are two sides of it. You just need to press the right side. And I think law tells us and teaches us the law side is the better than the right and the wrong side. So what you all today gave to all of us was that be on the law side. And once you know the law side, you will learn it better and you will apply it. And thank you very much. It was so interesting session. And I must tell you, I was receiving series of messages even from my colleagues. We started with 264. 264 out of which 195 were students, not just from SLS Noida, from few other law schools. So you could see 195 and rest of them were academicians or professionals. So this shows, and most of those messages were talking about that the character the panelists are carrying, because they are into the topic, they are talking about the topic, and they are also unfolding it, how they have been dealing with it. They are not hiding it. Rather, they are saying, this is how it is done, this is how it is done. And they liked it. And few of them rather said, wow, you organized this good panel discussion and we are happy we'll participate. So the credit goes to Anand and Anand. And it goes to the torch bearers of the firm. I have known Mr. Shravan for a long period. He was the one who rather associated this with this law school when nobody knew this law school. Nobody knew this law school. It goes to 2011 August. I remember I met him in the third week of July 2011 when I was meeting Mr. Praveen Anand, and we started working on the Raj Anand Moot Court competition with you all. Thank you very much, Mr. Shravan, for being so supportive. You always have been there. And Mr. Dhruv, we also met during that time. And we were having quite a good discussions in 2011, then 2013. And we never met, but it gave me that opportunity. I could meet you. And really, it was well done. Such a good moderation. And I was happy because people were so glued to. Look, the session started at 12:30. It is 2:10. We have 228 audience. What does it say? It says everything. It says everything, and it defines the term that people say that the attention span of the young ones is 15 minutes. Well, they defy it. It is more than that now. And that goes to because the discussion was not only intellectual, it was mysteriously interesting as well, because mystery lies beneath what you all are dealing with, that is called the patent law. And two words, I'm sorry, but I'm just taking one. These words have made the difference per se, and as such, I don't know when we will find the response for that. But this per se and as such has left everything to the discretion of the court. And the courts are really dealing with that in their own way. So thank you very much on behalf of Anand and Anand and Symbiosis Law School, Noida. I would like to thank all the participants for participating in today's event. And I'm sure that you came here as a learner and you have learned more because you have learned what is law. Thank you very much to all the participants. Thank you very much to Ashutosh Upadhyay, who rather started with this initiative, and you all have been so supportive that you took it to that level. Thank you very much, Ms. Riddhi. Thank you very much, Mr. Vibhav. Thank you very much, Mr. Dhruv Anand. And thank you very much, Mr. Shravan Chopra. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. It's been our pleasure. Very well organized, and you're a great storyteller.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye.